Natural Resources University is pleased to introduce one of our newest series, Fish University, hosted by Dr. Wes Neal.
Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fish University. This is the first podcast, and what I'm hoping will be quite a few podcasts down the road because, let's face it, the world of fish and fish management has quite a bit to talk about, and I think we're going to cover a lot of topics that will be interesting to many of you out there. If you didn't catch it from the intro, I am Wes Neal. I'm your host. I've been a fisheries professional for about 30 years, and my expertise lies in small lake and pond management, as well as tropical fisheries management, fish conservation, and a few other unique areas that I hope to bring forward in a few of these podcasts down the road. And I am an extension professor at Mississippi State University. That means that I'm the guy that people call when they have problems with their private properties and they want to talk about fish or weeds or what weed is this and how can I kill it, and a lot of the topics that I'm hoping we're going to cover in this podcast down the road. I'm really excited about this new podcast series. As I said, I hope we cover a lot of different topics that landowners will be able to use and enjoy their water more effectively. But I also hope to bring in some ideas and some interesting subject matter that may not be pond related. So some of these things we might talk about down the line may interest anybody who fishes, snorkels, or travels the world. Today I want to talk about a topic that is near and dear to many avid anglers out there, and that's how do you grow large, fat bass? That's right. Today we're going to share with you the secrets to growing trophy bass. And my guest today, many of you may already know from the Natural Resources University podcast series. He's one of the hosts of Deer University and my counterpart here at Mississippi State on the wildlife side. His name is Dr. Bronson Strickland. And you might be thinking, why do I have a wildlife biologist as a guest instead of a fisheries biologist? Well, the answer is simple. There's not that much different, really, between growing trophy bass and growing trophy bucks. Bronson, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here. And you've been doing this for 30 years.
Not the podcast, in about 30 seconds.
You've been an extension professional, a fisheries professional for 30-something years.
A fisheries professional.
You're old.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Bronson, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how old you are.
I'm not going to go into how old I am, but I've been doing this for a while, too. Yeah, so Wes and I, we're counterparts. We both work for the Mississippi State Extension Service. And Wes, you, of course, work on the fisheries side. I work on the wildlife side. And I think this topic that we're going to discuss today is from you and I doing so many workshops over the years where you're talking about bass and I'm talking about bucks and so many similarities in management that those two species have. So ought to be fun to talk about today.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why I invited you here today, was because when we've done these workshops together, I feel like I could give your talk, even though I have no training in wildlife management, because your talk is almost identical to mine. Mm-hmm. In fact, Bronson likes to tell people that when it comes to growing a trophy buck, that there's three main factors that go into that. And it's almost the same thing that we tell people on the fish side. Bronson, what are those three factors?
It always has been and always will be: age, nutrition, and genetics.
Exactly. And on the fish side, we tell people it's age, nutrition, genetics, but we add an extra one to that. Fish, of course, are what we call poikilothermic animals. That's just a fancy term. It just means they're cold-blooded. So their body temperature and their metabolism is regulated by their external temperature exposure, the water temperature essentially. So with fish, it's actually growing season is the factor that matters as well to age, nutrition, and genetics.
And you would say length of growing season?
Length of in terms of appropriateness of and how long it lasts. So We use something fancy called degree days. We're not going to really get into that, but essentially you want to have fish have the opportunity to be at their optimal temperatures for as long as possible. So if you think about that for a second, a fish, let's think about that largemouth bass swimming around in a pond. In this wintertime, it's really cold. Maybe it's 40 degrees, the water temperature. That bass is not metabolizing very much. It's not feeding very much. It's not moving around very much. Hence, it's not growing very much.
It's not growing very much.
In the springtime, it starts to warm up. Growth rates start to increase. The bass start to grow a whole lot faster. And then when you reach that optimal temperature, and that optimal temperature is right around 81 degrees or so is considered the optimal growth temperature for bass. That's when they're growing at their fastest. That's when they're eating at their greatest rate of consumption. They're eating lots of food, at least if they can catch it. Then in the summer, when it warms up even further, you end up having a problem where it gets too hot for them. Their metabolism needs too much energy that they can't catch. They start to need more and more energy. They can't get it, so they start to lose weight potentially when you get too hot. And then, of course, if it gets entirely too hot for them, now this is usually in the 100-degree plus range, a fish would die. So there's this parabolic, if you will, basically a half of that McDonald's M type relationship.
A bell curve type relationship.
A bell curve relationship, exactly, between temperature and growth of bass, where you want to be in the sweet spot. You don't want to be on where it's too cold. You don't want to be where it's too hot.
So I guess latitudinally, where does that lie for bass?
Great question. A lot of folks don't think about that. They don't think about the fact that there is an optimal latitude to potentially grow the biggest bass. And that, the idea is that too far north is too cold, right? So Minnesota's got lots of bass, good smallmouth bass fishing, good largemouth bass fishing. Minnesota's never going to break the world record for largemouth bass because they simply don't have enough or a long enough growing season. They grow really fast there, but they just don't do it for long enough during the year. And they tend to live longer up there, but it's just not enough to offset that slower or that lower growing season. As you move further and further south, you get closer and closer to that optimal growing range. Now, if you ever look at, I actually did this for my PhD many moons ago. I took the state record weights of bass and which lake it was caught in every state, and I plotted it latitude versus maximum weight. And it formed that very nice bell curve where up north, Minnesota, Dakotas, Michigan, the maximum size of bass is quite small. You might see a fish in this 8, 9, some of them 10-pound range, but you don't see those 15, 16, 17-pound bass towards the Canadian border. As you move further and further south, that size gets greater and greater, and eventually you get down to the area where the world record largemouth bass came from. The world record bass came from a latitude somewhere around 31 degrees north latitude. There's a range from 28 to 32 that seems to be the Goldilocks zone, if you will, where the next world record will probably be caught. And within that zone, bass grow really large. If you go into Texas, for example, Texas every year produces a dozen to several dozen fish every year that are bigger than more than half of all the other states' state record.
Wow.
Really big fish.
Now, is that just because of opportunity? It's a bigger land area, more bodies of water, and so it's a probability thing?
No, it's actually a couple of things, one of which is growing season. It's right at the right latitude. Some other things, there's some management, and that's what we're going to cover next time, but it's definitely growing season. They've got good resources, they've got good management, they've got good food opportunities. The fish, have time to get older, all those things we talked about, age, genetics, and food, but it also has a really good growing season. Now, someone out there who's listening to this might be saying right now, well, hold on a second. What about Japan? Now, I know Japan just tied the world record. And what about California? California grows some really big fish. Yes, both of those are true, but Japan and California are both regulated by ocean currents. The ocean currents affect the climate to which, even though their latitude is a little bit higher than that optimal range, the ocean currents make that latitude feel more like 30 degrees north latitude as opposed to 34, 36, 38 degrees north
So
latitude.
the water temps are in the optimal zone. It just doesn't follow the latitudinal continuum on the mainland of the U.S.
Exactly. And you may have heard California called a Mediterranean climate before. It's because the ocean currents regulate the climate, at least the coastal climates, where it's not too hot, it's not too cold. It's the Goldilocks zone.
Goldilocks
It's
is
just
just right.
right. Exactly. That's why we see some big fish coming from other places. But here in the U.S., in the mainland U.S., mostly it's going to be around that 30-degree, give or take, too. As you start moving further south, that's when things get really crazy. Now, I do a lot of work down in the tropics with largemouth bass, down in the Caribbean islands, for example. As you move further and further south, the maximum size of bass declines. Now, I know everybody who's listening to me has heard of Lake Okeechobee.
Oh, yeah.
Lake Okeechobee is famous for big bass. They go out there and they fish with golden shiners. They'll take a float. Usually it's a balloon or a big bobber, and they'll put a huge golden shiner and they'll toss it up into the grass or the cattails. And, they're catching these consistently catching 9, 10, 11-pound bass. And it's famous for that. However, they're never going to break the world record out of Lake Okeechobee. It's just too far south. And what happens is those fish, they're doing good. They're growing well. They've got a lot of days they can grow big, but they also have a lot of days when it probably gets just a hair too warm for them and they're stressing out. So as you move further and further down the peninsula of Florida, the maximum size of bass declines. And as you get really far south, like Puerto Rico, where I work, it's very rare to see those bigger fish. In fact, they don't live very long either. That's another topic for another time, but we call it the live fast, die young, where in Puerto Rico, for example, most fish rarely exceed about age 4 or so.
So Okeechobee would be, in the deer world, it would be if you wanted somewhere to go see, hunt, harvest a whole bunch of 150 class bucks, it would be a great spot. However, it's not going to be the place to go break the world record and to shoot a 200-inch buck.
Exactly.
Because of those environmental constraints you're talking about.
Now, northern Florida, you start moving north, you get around Orlando and further north, you start seeing bigger and bigger fish. The world record came from southern Georgia. That's right there. That's 31 degrees north latitude, right in the zone. So northern Florida to southern Georgia, across through, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, all have potential, not necessarily going to break it because it takes more than just growing season. It takes, as we said, genetics, nutrition, and age. So as I said, Bronson and I, we do these workshops together, and when I hear his presentations, man, it sounds like mine. I say exactly the same thing except to add on growing season. So Bronson, we talked about a little bit about growing season. I know with deer, you actually have growing season isn't quite as important to antler size, but you do have something, principle where body size actually does get bigger, but it's the opposite, right?
Yeah, so think of it this way. You were describing how fish, and they're cold-blooded, which means they're kind of a product of their environment. They're getting heat from their environment. With mammals, mammals being warm-blooded, they're generating their own heat. And so essentially we see a continuum, and there's always exceptions because there's a lot of mammals and so forth, but generally there's a continuum as you move from southern latitude to northern latitude. Within a species, for example, within deer, their body size typically gets larger, and it's thought of as heat conservation. And so there's the relationship of body weight relative to surface area. And so as you move, you keep using Minnesota as an example, or Alberta, Canada, or wherever. On the average, those deer have a larger body weight, body mass, but as such, the surface area is relatively less. And so it's just a way that they can conserve heat. Correspondingly, when you move to the deep south and into Florida, you kind of have the opposite problem. In that case, it's heat dissipation. And so it's really not advantageous for a deer in South Florida to weigh 325 pounds. That's a really big body. You're going to have a difficult time shedding or dissipating your body heat with the ambient temperatures. So it's just a very general relationship that we see from south to north, where bucks or deer, and bucks especially, they're going to get larger. Their body size is going to get larger. And as a result, people can be very interested in body size, but where the rubber meets the road is antler size. And so there's a general relationship at the population scale where we see larger bodies, we also see larger antlers. And so when you combine that relationship and then you add in age, nutrition, genetics, and especially nutrition, you will then see on this latitudinal gradient, the biggest deer come from the Midwest. The Midwest is kind of the perfect place because you have the latitude relative to body size, that environmental context you were talking about. But then what is the Midwest also offering? Say Pennsylvania or New York, the Midwest is offering an agricultural environment, so food. So it's kind of, you're combining both of those facets, and you get the most trophy bucks.
Interesting. One of the things that popped into my head while you were talking about latitude and deer is I know that in the deer world, this is less common in the fish world, thankfully, we have a number of deer farms that are usually up north, like Michigan area, and those deer farms grow massive bucks and will sell them to some of these canned hunt places down south. What happens when you take a deer out of the north, fly it on an airplane to South Texas, and release it?
It's usually not a good outcome. Of course, the deer breeding industry has really evolved in the last 20 plus years. But so you have an environmental effect like you're talking about. It's a body or a phenotype that's really not suited for the environment you're taking it to. So like you say, you're going from Minnesota to Florida, that's going to be difficult. But what can even be more important, Wes, are the diseases that go with it.
Do you find that scientific term? Bronson, you mentioned phenotype. Our listeners may not be aware what you mean by that. Can you explain it?
Probably not very well, but I'll try. So just go back to high school biology. Every individual, every organism, an individual within an organism has a genotype and a phenotype. The genotype is just simply the genetic code that the animal possesses. The phenotype is really what they look like. So very simply, like for deer, how large the body is, how long the legs are, how big the antlers are, etc. That's the describing the phenotype or the look or measurable traits of the animal.
Basically, the phenotype is the expression in that particular environment of the genotype.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So now we talked a little bit about latitude. I think we probably covered that one. What about age? Let's talk about age.
Okay. So with whitetail deer, they have growth that essentially, and it's a little bit different for bucks and for does, but we're kind of sticking with bucks here. In most regions, we think their body growth peaks or stops in terms of bone growth about 5 years of age. And generally with bucks, they have typically reached their skeletal maturity by 3 or 4. And then once they reach 5 years of age, and it'll literally go from 5 to 7, 8, 9, 10, all depending on the availability of food, that is when they reach their maximum body mass. So speaking in generalities, typically what happens is a buck reaches skeletal maturity at 3 or 4. They're going to reach body weight maturity at 5 or 6, and they will typically maintain that until 8, 9, or 10. And exactly the same for antler size. So antler size typically peaks and is maintained from like 5 to 9 years of age. But that all depends on how long they keep it. It all depends on resource availability, how reliable it is from year to year. So if you're in an area where the environment is going to swing a lot from year to year, great example is South Texas with rainfall. You could see a fluctuation in a particular individual of 20 inches from year to year just because of food availability. But if food were available all the time at the same amount from year to year, you're essentially going to see a flat line, give or take, of course, but they reach that maximum, hold that maximum for 3 to 5 years or so.
Now, what I took from that was it's a good idea to hold off harvesting a buck until it reaches potential maximum size if the environment is conducive to maintaining that maximum body size. So you're saying it's probably best to wait until a buck is 5 to 7 years old to harvest.
If that is your goal. So there's a lot of people that just want to see a deer. A lot of people just want to shoot any deer. But for those people where their goal is they are managing for older bucks or trophy bucks, they want to maximize antler potential, then you need to wait until at least 5 years of age. And in other places, Wes, like for example, in Mississippi, we have a lot of variation in available nutrition due to the landscape. So we have our farming country in the Delta region, which is very similar to the Midwest. And then we have the southern part of our state where it is primarily industrial pine forest and things like that. But very little food availability, certainly not at the similar quality to what would be in the agricultural region. And we will see that growth rates and peak antler size may be a year or two later in that region, whereas it may be a year or two earlier in the, quote, good nutrition region. So in our Delta region, you're looking at peaks in antler size very close to 4, certainly by 5. If you're down in our lower coastal plain region near the coast, it's more like 6 or 7.
So now that's quite a bit different from bass, because when we talk about fish have what we call infinite growth. Fish never technically stop growing. Sure, they slow down in their growth. They will grow really fast at first, and then as they get larger, they tend to put on less and less weight every year, but they will never truly stop growing as long, and you mentioned resources, as long as the resources are available. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, if there's a change in the resource availability, that can affect growth, and they can actually lose weight. We talked about temperature, they could lose weight there, but in general, on average, a fish will continue to grow throughout its life. So you can't really tell people, well, wait until that bass is this old. Plus, there's a lot of variability we'll get into with genetics, that if you had 3 fish that are 10 years old, one could be 4 pounds, one could be 8 pounds, and one could be 16 pounds, because there's so many factors that go into it. I always like to think about it in terms of combination lock. If you've got one of those combination locks that you need to put in 3 or 4 numbers, if one number's right, the lock's not going to open. If 3 of the numbers are right and you need to put in 4 numbers, the lock's not going to open. You need all 4 of those numbers to open the lock. Well, you need all 4 of age, genetics, nutrition, and in fish growing season to get that maximum potential out of the fish.
Yeah. Very similar with deer. You got to have all of those. Yeah.
So we've covered age. With fish, you cannot really say there's a specific age you need to harvest that fish at, because they always get bigger. And let's face it, a lot of the bass anglers, their goal is not to harvest a bass to begin with. They want to catch that bass. They want to take a picture with it, weigh it, and release it, and hope to catch it again when it's a pound or 2 bigger. So from a fish standpoint, unlike a deer standpoint, when you harvest a deer, the deer's gone. It's removed from the population. There's no way to practice catch and release with hunting.
Right.
But with fishing, you can do catch and release. That fish can have the opportunity to get larger down the road. But for sure, it's critical that a bass is allowed to grow until it reaches that larger size. Obviously, if you take a bass out when it's 1.5 pounds, it's never going to be 10 pounds. But that's a really slippery slope, because when we talk about food, one of the best ways to manage for food isn't necessarily just fertilizing or managing water quality or stocking new prey species. It's managing the number of mouths that are eating. And one of the worst things a bass fisherman, I tell people that one of the worst things that ever happened to pond management was, and no offense to Ray Scott, who just passed away recently, but Ray Scott and BASS, they came up with this idea of catch and release fishing. What happened was, my understanding is that Ray Scott had just started BASS, and they were traveling around the country. These professional anglers were going from lake to lake, and occasionally to, outside of their own home ranges. They're out going to new lakes around the country. And the local anglers are watching these professionals come in who were really good, and they were catching these big bass, and they were bringing them back to ramp, and those big bass were dying. They were putting them in an ice chest. They were putting on a stringer to bring them back to weigh them in for the tournament. And Ray went out west, and he went and watched a trout tournament. And he watched these fly fishermen catching these small, 10-inch trout and gently releasing them back to the river, and thought, man, what if we could do that with our bass? What if we could catch them, keep them alive, and release them back into the system? How much greater that would be for public perception alone, if not for conservation. And he came back, he got with some friends in Alabama, and they created the first live wells. And that's where catch and release fishing came from. Well, it's true that out on a 20,000 acre public water body that gets tremendous fishing pressure from lots of people every day of the week, all year long, that you need to conserve those fish through letting a lot of them go. That's why we have things like length limits and slot limits and ways to protect fish in public water. But when you have a 10-acre pond that you fish 4 times a year and you're not taking fish out, what do you think happens?
You're going to get overcrowded.
You're going to get overcrowded, exactly. So harvesting bass is the main management tool that the pond owner has, taking bass out. The best way I like to think about it is, let's say a pond can hold 100 pounds of bass. That could be 200 half-pound bass. That could be 100 one-pound bass. It could be 25-pound bass. So if you want big fish, the way you do it is you have fewer bass, so that amount of energy that supports it, the carrying capacity, goes into fewer bass that are larger. Does that translate in the deer world?
Yeah, little bit different. Your quote habitat is contained better than, say, on the deer management side, meaning that deer can leave your property. They can't leave your pond, but they can leave your property. But fundamentally, yeah, the relationship is the same. If you have too many deer or too many mouths relative to the amount of food that is provided, the deer are going to respond with a smaller body size. And eventually the deer are going to respond in a density-dependent manner, in that at some point fawns aren't going to live. So that is one way that the system will regulate itself, is that when there's not enough food to support new fawns, all the fawns are going to die. But of course, as a manager, we never want it to get to that point. We want to manage the density appropriately so that all of the animals are healthy.
And how do you do that?
That comes with harvest. That's the bow, the rifle, the muzzleloader.
But should you be shooting that 2.5-year-old buck?
All depends on the product that you want. There can be scenarios where, if density is truly the biggest problem and you just need to remove deer, there can be a circumstance where you would want to prioritize doe harvest. And this is 90+% of the cases, is you're going to accomplish this with doe harvest. But there are also cases, I think, Wes, similar to what you're describing with catch and release. We will see, and when I say we, I mean Steve Damaris and myself and others that work around here, too many younger bucks, middle-aged bucks, have also been released over the years, and they live for a very long time. So you have this 3 or 4 or now 5-year-old buck. A mature buck can eat a ton of forage every year, and he has below average antler quality. As such, most hunters aren't going to select him for harvest. And so what you will see over time is the accumulation of some of the lower antler quality bucks that need to be harvested. Well, they don't eat. Just because they have smaller antlers doesn't mean they're not eating. And so you'll get a large part of the population that's essentially not eligible for harvest because of hunter preference, but they're still out there and they're eating. And so what we recommend is that you're just very strategic about what bucks you remove, what bucks you spare, because they have the probability of them growing into the product you want. Trophy status is good. We want to spare them. But there's also a whole bunch of bucks right there in the middle. They're 3 or 4 years of age. Their antler size is lower quality. It is below average. We want to harvest those as well as harvesting the does. Did that get a little too complicated there on the... harvest regime.
It made sense to me. I guess what the listener may want to know is how do you know which buck to take out? I mean, you got to really be good at aging the buck on the fly, right?
Yeah, this is something it's not for a beginner. Of course, this is going to be either getting some counsel and expertise from a biologist, or over time your familiarity with the property. But you eventually learned, yes, the single most critical factor is you have to learn to age live deer. And that can literally be while you're hunting. Of course, you got to age them. But then also we have this opportunity now with trail cameras. So many hunters are able to capture 50, 70, 80% of the deer they're going to see, the bucks they're going to see. They've got a trail cam photo of them. So it's working with people and saying, how old do you think this buck is? Is he a young buck, a middle-aged buck, or a mature buck? And then pairing that with the antler size. Is this a 3.5-year-old buck that shows great promise to grow into what we're managing for? Or is this a 3-year or 4-year-old buck that is not going that direction? And so you just make we're going to spare this deer and let it pass, or we're going to harvest this buck for management. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with managing for genetics. Like I read about in hunting magazines or see on TV, you're not taking it out of the gene pool or anything like that. Cannot manipulate genetics via harvest on a free-ranging deer herd. It's just impossible. You are simply doing it from the perspective of where you started, Wes, with food conservation and density. You're pairing strategic buck harvest with doe harvest to maximize the amount of food you have for the deer you're managing for.
So you're managing the individual, not the population level. You're taking that individual out because that individual will never have potential to be a trophy buck.
That's correct. So I would say you are managing a bunch of individuals and simultaneously managing the population. You're managing for population level food availability by targeting the harvest of specific individuals as well as does.
I think I remember you saying in one of your seminars that an adult doe can eat a basketball-sized amount of vegetation every day.
More than that.
More than that.
More than that.
One of the problems I run into is getting people to shoot doe. They don't care. It's all about those antlers, which we've all heard the adage, you can't eat the antlers anyway. For me, it's meat first. I'd love the opportunity to shoot a world-class buck someday. I probably never will. As long as I have 2 to 3 does in the freezer every year, I'm happy. How do you get people to take out those does?
That has been a challenge for the past 20 years, always will be. But typically when you get a population of hunters, so like in our context, the hunting club around here, it might be the lease, you might call it if you're in Texas, but you typically will have some of your hunters, or they may not say they're meat hunters, but they enjoy shooting, they enjoy harvesting. And so they may do all of the heavy lifting by killing 4, 5, or 6 does apiece. But there are some hunters that just do not want to pull the trigger on a female. They totally are just trophy-minded or buck-only minded, and they want to wait for those. But the bottom line is there's a lot of different ways to accomplish it. You just have to figure out what way works for your property. Yeah, because it's irrefutable. I mean, you have to harvest deer. If you're on a large enough, some exceptions could be a small acreage property. And what I mean is if I'm on a 70-acre property or something like that, you're really not able to harvest enough deer on that size of property to affect the deer density at large at a landscape level.
Too many coming from off
That's right.
property.
Dispersal, exactly. On and off, right.
You said something really critical there is you have to harvest does. Well, you have to harvest bass in a pond as well. There's a lot of similarities there and a lot of differences. First of all, we can't age a fish very easily. You catch a bass, and that bass is 15 inches and maybe 3 pounds, and you can't look at that bass and say, oh, that's a 5-year-old. He needs to come out. He's not growing very well. Or, oh, that's a young bass that's got a lot of potential. You can't really do that from an age standpoint. What we use instead are characteristics such as, is that bass thin? A thin bass needs to put on weight before it can grow larger. If it's already skinny, it's going to have to take all those calories and put it into getting fat before it's really acceptable and can get bigger. Whereas if you catch a bass that looks like a football, that bass is probably pretty effective at eating. It's growing really well. It's fat, and it's got potential to get larger. But you can't really age a bass and cull a bass like you can cull a buck.
Right.
What you can do, though, is there's a couple things you can do. One is if you can tell a male from a female, I'll tell you right now, a male bass will never be a trophy bass. They rarely get bigger than 5 pounds. I was talking with someone the other day that says that in the hatchery situation, they've had them up to about 7.5. That's a really big male. They're never going to get any bigger than that. Every single double-digit bass that's ever been caught is a girl. If you can tell a male from a female, and in the springtime it's a lot easier than in the fall, if you can tell that female from a male, you can selectively harvest males, take them out of the population, because that's 50% of the population in a normal wild population that's never going to have trophy potential. Mm-hmm. The second thing you do is pick out any fish that looks undersized, skinny. If you've got a bass crowded situation, you'll have lots of fish that look like more like an eel than the bass. That fish
I've caught my share of those.
Those fish will take so much resources to get fat again before they start growing. They're better just coming out. Mm-hmm. So as far as selective harvest goes, it's harder to do with fish, but it can be done with fish. The main thing is you just need to take out lots and lots of little fish. As I said, that whole idea of, would you rather have 10 10-pound bass or 100 1-pound bass? The more little ones you take out, the more food's available for the ones that remain. And that's how you can get it more food, as well as managing, I know in the deer world, I'm sure you've taught many a course on food plots and putting out the right food, making sure the soil is fertile, making sure the soil has the right pH. We do exactly the same thing in the fish world, where we check alkalinity of the pond water or the soil underneath, and if it needs lime, we have to lime it to make sure it has the full potential to utilize nutrients and to be productive and to not have wild swings in pH. We use fertilization to try to bolster the productivity of the system, grow more phytoplankton makes more zooplankton makes more prey fish makes more bass. So we can do all these things, but it's all a waste of your time and your money if you don't keep the population at bay. And that's what the problem in pond management is, especially in the southern U.S., bass crowding is probably the number one problem we see in ponds. Now, if you go up north, you can see that brim crowding or bluegill crowding tends to be more common a lot of times. And that's a really weird relationship we can talk about. It has a lot to do with vegetation density. Down here in the south, we don't like any vegetation. Up north, you need like 30-40% vegetation to allow the bass habitat to persist and stay out there. So you see more brim crowding up north. Down here, I rarely see a brim crowded situation except in a very small pond where bass have been so over-harvested that the bass are just gone. But we've talked about let them get old, but only let specific ones get old. Make sure they've got lots of food. You can't really do anything about growing season. That just leaves one topic, and it's usually the most contentious topic in my world. So I'm sure in the deer world, genetics is probably a topic that's gotten you in trouble a few times. I know it definitely has got me in trouble in the fish world, but tell me about deer genetics.
I wouldn't say it's gotten me in trouble. I would say it's offended a lot of people. Offended may be too strong of a word, but it's certainly the topic where you will see people have a puzzled look on their face, and it can be kind of difficult to explain. And to say genetics is not important is not true. It's the context at which you think about genetics. Genetics absolutely is going to affect, the magic word we said earlier, the phenotype of the individual. So for every single individual, their genetics are important. That's going to be the blueprint for how big they get, how large their antlers are, etc. But it's not something we can do anything about. And so in terms of from a management perspective or a selective harvest perspective, people have to remember that there's so many interacting issues there that are out of the hunter or manager's control. Very simply, for example, the female is controlling 50% of her son's genotype. getting half his genes from his mother. There is no way to look at a 90, 100, 120-pound doe, whatever it is, and make a harvest decision based on, I think her son is going to have above average or below average antlers. There's just no way to do it. Another big factor is dispersal. And that's where having a fence, you can start making some gains in that regard. And that's not what I'm advocating, but that can make managing for genetics a little more feasible, is when you're controlling for dispersal. So let's say even if you could make a harvest decision of removing that particular female, removing that male, and then eventually you have, quote, these genetically improved, buck fawns on your property, 70+% of them are going to disperse off of your property. And the yearling bucks that are going to be on your property the next year, most of them came from off of your property. So there's this constant exchange of genotypes that's going on that's completely out of your control. Another thing we look at is called breeding value. And we're just wrapping up a study in Texas looking at this, and it's just remarkable that there's no relationship between the antler size of a buck and his breeding value in terms of his offspring. In that study, there were bucks that have really, really large antlers that had sons with really small antlers. There were some sires, some bucks with really small antlers that had really large antlered sons. And so when you put all of these things together, there's nothing you can do about it. So are genetics important biologically? Of course they are, but there's nothing you can do about it. So control the things you can control. Control age, control nutrition, and the genetics will take care of itself.
Maybe that's why I get in trouble more than you do, is because in the fisheries world, we actually can have more control over what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we control the fish that are initially stocked into a pond, and those fish don't leave, and no new fish don't come in unless we add them.
Right.
So we have more control.
You're stocking in a high fence.
Exactly. It's essentially like a high fence operation for deer. But with the problem we have, well, first of all, there's this whole concept of, which strain or species of largemouth bass should I stock? And if you're not familiar with largemouth bass, there's a northern largemouth bass that is the largemouth bass. It's the one most people are familiar with. It exists everywhere from Canada down to Texas, across to Georgia. And then there's the Florida bass. And the Florida bass is only pure the southern half of Florida's peninsula. And then from the northern half of Florida's peninsula up through Georgia, lower Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, there's a natural zone of where the two populations are mixed.
Mm-hmm.
And in the past 30, 40 years, people have noticed that Florida bass get pretty large. So Florida bass have been taken from Florida and introduced all over the country. In fact, they've been taken pretty far north in some cases and put into lakes, trying to skew the genetics of those lakes more towards Florida bass genes. And there's some indication it grows bigger fish, but the reality of it is, if you're north of Interstate 40 that runs from Raleigh, North Carolina, all the way to California, but stays at roughly the same latitude, around 35 degrees north latitude or so, anywhere north of that, you're probably better off with a northern largemouth bass. Anywhere south of that, you're probably going to be better off with Florida bass. But the reality of it is the genetics make such a small contribution to the overall potential when you talk about the other three factors, especially food.
Mm-hmm.
If you manage that system and you make a smorgasbord for all of those fish that you have, and you have unlimited prey, you do everything you can to make sure that all a bass has to do to eat is open its mouth, you're going to get good growth.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether you stocked Florida bass, northern bass, or the hybrid bass, which are being sold. And that's where I get in trouble most. And when I talk about hybrid bass, everything they say about the hybrid bass is true. They say it grows like a Florida bass and it bites like a northern bass, and that's absolutely true. The problem is it reproduces.
Yeah.
And as soon as it reproduces, you've got
dilution.
And the offspring, when you get down That's what we call the F1 generation. When you get the F2 generation, F3, and then they start back crossing, it's an FX generation. You get several generations removed, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests the offspring are not as good as either one of the parents. So when you stock your pond, you put F1 hybrids out there, that's great. For 5 or 6 years, you're going to have good fishing, but they're going to reproduce after 2 or 3 years, and then those fish are going to reproduce after 2 or 3 years, and before long, it's just a bunch of genetic mutts out there.
Yeah.
The best way I can describe this to people is to think about the corn farmer in Iowa that grows Bronson's big deer.
Mm-hmm.
That corn farmer, probably 99% of all corn farmers, if not 100%, grow hybrid corn. They buy their corn seed from a producer that's a hybrid corn seed. They put it in their field. They grow their corn. They harvest their corn, but they absolutely never save the seed and replant it because it's no longer going to be hybrid corn. It's no longer F1 generation corn. Now it's F2 generation corn, and it's not as good. Mm-hmm. They go back to the company that produced the F1 generation corn, and they buy new seed from them every single time because otherwise they lose that, what they call hybrid vigor. Mm-hmm. The hybrid vigor is when you cross two species, it does better than either one of the parents. Right. They lose that after that first generation. So same thing's true with fish. You put F1 fish in a pond, they're going to do really well, but their offspring may not do quite as well.
That's interesting. Very interesting. Hadn't thought of that. And so just over time, that dilution and eventually it's kind of regression to the mean, or you just finally, there's an optimal phenotype for that pond relative to the density and the food availability?
I'm not sure that I would call it a regression to the mean. What I would call it, it's actually worse than that. Because when you take two species, and some people consider the northern bass and the Florida largemouth bass to be two separate species, when you hybridize two species and then they begin to back cross, it actually doesn't go towards some new optimal or back towards the parents. It actually, they experience something called outbreeding depression, which actually can make them worse than either of the parents were to begin with. So the initial cross is better than the parents, but then 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8 generations down the road. And remember, most people stock their ponds to have fishing for the next 30, 40, 50 years. 30, 40, 50 years is 15 to 20 generations of bass that aren't as good as if they would just stock Florida bass or northern bass.
That's a complicated topic.
It is, and we could spend all day, and I said I've gotten in trouble with the producers from it. Mm-hmm. But the reality of it is, it doesn't really matter as long as you're managing for those other three factors, especially food resources.
Right.
So
don't neglect the things that you can control.
Exactly.
So that they have the greatest leverage and return on investment.
Exactly. And you may be saying, well, what about this growing season? Well, your pond is where your pond is. Unless you want to buy a really intensive chiller and heater system for your pond, you're not going to be able to control that. Yeah. Genetics, pick the right genetics for your pond, start there, and then over time. Now, we can talk a little bit more about genetics in terms of inbreeding depression. We haven't mentioned inbreeding depression. Well, when you stock a pond, here in Mississippi, we recommend 50 bass per acre. So let's say you've got a 2-acre pond. 2-acre pond, you stock 100 fingerling bass in it. Those 100 fingerlings, probably got them all from the same hatchery, right? Mm-hmm. Chances are they're all the same size. They might have all come from the same broodstock pair.
Okay.
So you may have just started off your pond with 100 fish that are all brothers and sisters.
Right.
That's not good because you get inbreeding depression. Those fish don't have the genetic diversity to persist and reproduce over time, and that could cause problems down the road. So first, it may be a good idea to get fingerlings fish from a couple different sources.
Okay.
Just to make
diversify.
Just to make sure you've got a little bit more genetic diversity. Second, and there's not a whole lot of research to back this up, but intuitively from a genetic standpoint, it may be worthwhile to consider an occasional refreshment stocking where you bring in fish of the same strain. If you stock Florida bass, bring in Florida bass. If you stock northern bass, bring in northern bass. But bring in some new fish from a different hatchery just to sort of add a little new genetics to the gene pool.
Okay.
And
Makes sense.
that's not something that's been tested, but one of the things I've noticed just from my personal experience is when I look at ponds that are 10 years old, they tend to have bigger fish than I look at a pond that's 50 years old. And that's small ponds. Bigger ponds may not be the same. Now, of course, there's that whole boom and bust cycle of reservoirs. All that comes into play as well. So it's complicated. But,
Always is.
But it's not a bad idea to diversify your genetics from the start and then possibly refresh them over time. So that's something else you could keep in mind in trying to grow those bigger fish. But you don't want to go stocking Florida bass on top of northern bass, on top of F1 hybrids, and start diluting the overall purity of the stock from a standpoint of that outbreeding depression we talked about. You want to try to avoid that if at all possible. Again, if you did that already, don't be freaking out. That's something a lot of folks stocked F1 hybrids. A lot of folks stock Floridas and northern fish so that their offspring are F1 hybrids. If you did that, management is still way more important than anything else. Keeping the food resources to them you still can grow big fish. Don't freak out. Don't kill off your pond and start over again.
We tend to neglect the simple things that have the greatest leverage, that make the biggest impact, and we. Me included, as a human, we're always looking for the quick fix.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, there are ways. I mean, there are other ways to manipulate genetics, and we're going to talk about that next time when we have our next guest in here, because some really cool stuff that's coming out of Texas. We're going to talk about selective breeding to grow bass with greater trophy potential, but we'll cover that more next time. Bronson, is there anything else you want to talk about or topics we want to cover?
No, I think that about covers it. Just welcome aboard to the podcast network. I know you're going to have a lot of people very interested in this topic. So, and I think you're the perfect person to tackle it because, like me, this is the world we live in and what we talk about and write about all the time. So I think it's going to be of great interest.
I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to doing this down the road. I've got a lot of cool topics in mind that I want to cover. And sometimes it'll be a little off topic. I know today folks might be sitting there thinking, why are we talking about deer again? But we're trying to appeal to everyone's interests. So a lot of times I'm going to be talking about pond management or trophy trout management, but sometimes we might be talking about Amazonian fishes, just whatever it may be. Red snapper season, maybe I'll have a guest in that talks about red snapper fishing. So we can cover a lot of topics here. We don't need to focus on ponds alone, and that's going to be the goal over the next episodes and next years, hopefully many years down the line. So Bronson, thank you for coming today.
Yes, sir. Happy to.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks everybody for being here. If you want to contact me, my email address is wes.neal, that's WESNEAL @msstate.edu. Shoot me an email if you have a topic you want to hear discussed or have a question or anything else, feel free to contact me. Bronson, once again, thanks a lot for being here, and I hope to see everybody next time. Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.